Hey everyone, I'm Stephanie, host and head bookologist here at the Get Literate podcast. I'm a book loving, notebook hoarding reader and writer on a mission to change lives one book and one notebook at a time. On this podcast, we explore the power of bookology. What's that? That's the study of books and reading and notebooks and writing mixed with mindful practices and creativity to create lives we love. Here, you'll find episodes exploring the reading and writing life and how they can make our actual lives better. You'll get book recommendations and notebooking prompts around particular themes, and you'll even hear from authors and special guests who can fuel our reading and writing hearts and help us take inspired action in our own daily practices. So, grab a notebook and your TBR list, and let's get literate. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Get Literate podcast. I'm Stephanie, your host and bookologist, here with an episode, again, to explore how reading and writing can make life better. Today, I'm chatting with a special guest about the power of sharing our stories. And before we begin, I want to clearly state one thing. We all have a story, and therefore we all have a story to tell. Even if we don't think we do, we do. And even if we don't think we could publish those stories, there are lots of ways to share them with others. Frank Winters is here to remind us of just that and to share his 10 little rules for sharing your story. So get out your notebooks, get comfortable, and let's begin. Frank, welcome to the Get Literate podcast. I am so glad you're here today.
Oh, thank you. It's all my pleasure. I have been looking forward to this for a really long time, so it's fantastic.
Well, we first met because of your connection to Carol Pearson, right, who happens to be your sister. And for those of you not listening, you might want to head back to episode 115, because in that episode, Carol and I talked about 10 little rules for a blissy life. And those 10 little rules for a blissy life are part of a bigger 10 little rules series of books. Depending on what you want and need or wish in your life, there is a book for you to help you get it. And not just a book, but a book and a journal inside to help you literally bring these ideas to life in your own life. And Frank is here to talk about his 10 Little Rules book, 10 Little Rules to Sharing Your Story. So, Frank, I want you to start with your story. Can you share a little bit about you and what led you to creating this book?
Yeah, absolutely. A younger version of myself would never have pictured me writing a book. I didn't even want to read a book. I was undiagnosed dyslexic. Reading was exhausting. Reading out loud was terrifying.
Yeah.
So I gravitated towards reading a map and doing math and doing the things that didn't move around in my head, right? My eyes were competing for dominance, right? But over time, it's kind of like how a blind person develops an acute sense of hearing or smell. I wound up being able to speak in front of a group because it was way easier than the terror of reading in front of a group. And it kind of developed this style. I wound up as a career geographer because I could easily pick up information from a map because it didn't wiggle around like the words on a page did with dyslexia. So no regrets. Those things turned into what seemed like deficiencies seemed to turn into real blessings. So my father died in fall of 2020. My mother died in fall of 2021. Following each of their deaths, my sisters and I have three older sisters and one sister-in-law, so four mothers and five mothers now. I spent a week in a hotel with these wonderful, super intelligent siblings. And we talked about everything from what do you want in your taco to our parents' legacy while planning a funeral and everything else. And it became very clear that our mother's legacy started when we were young and we did family camping trips. My mother would insist that we leave the campsite better than we found it. She would further insist we leave a courtesy pile of wood for the people who would come next. And she would make up a story that had details, people's names, and what the kids were wearing or whatever it was, and how they had car trouble on the way, and our pile of wood saved their trip because they were planning hot dogs for dinner, and the kids were overtired, and and they were able to get off to a good vacation. So she instilled stewardship and empathy. So when we really sorted out and unpacked her legacy, we kind of decided that we needed to expand it from the kid version of Leave the Campsite Better Than You Found It to the adult version of Leave the World a Better Place because you're part of it. So I'll start a public talk with, is the world a better place because you're part of it, and let the silence hang in the air. And then, yeah, absolutely. We're here. We're here working on something. Listeners of this podcast are driving along and we're in their back seat just having a chat, or they're sitting at the table with us. So yes, you're already the bias cross section of the world because you're here investing in and learning something and interested in sharing your story. But what do we do today, this week, this year to maximize the extent to which that is true? So I started to unpack that, and I realized that the thing that I crave the most professionally and in my personal life as a combination is the thing most people fear the most, and that is public speaking. So this was going to be 10 little rules for public speaking, and Carol, in her brilliance, opened the aperture and expanded that to sharing your story. And the message is your story doesn't even have to be about you. Your lens and the topic you're talking about is yours because no person in the world has the combined experiences, thoughts, and not to mention DNA that you have had. So your lens is unique, and it has value just because it's unique. So that's why I'm here. I'm so excited. Never thought I'd be talking on a literature podcast because that was not my jam. But maybe folks that are really good at writing and reading, we can all learn from each other. Your listeners have skills far beyond mine in writing and reading. Yet we can learn and apply some of that. And I'd love to bridge the gaps. And these are my rules. They apply to me, but I don't come with any answers. I only come with the right questions, examples, and then the right questions. And that's what the 10 little rules is all about. Rules are way more fun and way easier to follow when you write your own.
They are. They are. And I think that's what I love about your book. That's what I love about Carol's book, about all the books, is that it is a book that begs you to reflect. It invites you to sink into what you've said and then apply it to your own life, whether that's adopting the rule, adapting the rule, or figuring out your own rule. These books are like I don't know what the word is. I'll probably think of it later when I'm not recording this podcast, but like this multi-genre of a personal development plus a notebook. And I think that's
Yeah.
the beauty of them, because readers, when you read, you're so compelled because you have a little bit of you there, you have your story, and then you have a little bit of the information of why this is important to think about, and then we think about it. So I do love the format. I think it is set up so beautifully to think about what our stories are, even if we don't think we have one. As I said, as you said, you do have one. Even if it's not yours, it's a story to tell about something as it relates to you. And so I would love for you to talk a little bit more about your very first rule. And I love your first rule because it literally is share your story, but you break it down into, instead of a 3-word, one sentence, we've got 1 word, 3 sentences that totally messed up. But let's see if I could say it. Instead of share your story, it's share your story. And you unpack each of those 3 words, which I think are so important, especially for the person who thinks, well, sharing my story means publishing a memoir. I'm not going to do that. And it is so much more. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about Rule 1 specifically and how important those periods were in between those words of that sentence.
Yeah, and that's great. And the way you just introduced that, thank you for that. Um, you jumped right to rule 9, play the pause, share your story.
Yes,
And there's energy and there's meaning in the pause too. So anyways, we'll jump to that later.
I love
But
that.
those 3 words, share, it's an exchange, it's an interaction. And how you describe the format of books is really my approach to most communication that is impactful and public speaking in particular. But I don't want an audience. I don't want listeners. I want participants,
Mm.
because I started a talk at the National States Geographic Information Council, and I started it with, the next 10 minutes has the potential to being the most impactful 10 minutes of my life, but that's up to you. I'm Frank Winters, and I'm happy to be here. So what does that do? It engages them. It throws them
Yeah,
off,
I
right? Now they're
love
like, oh, I've
that.
got something I need to do. And it takes all the pressure off of me,
Yeah,
because they're the ones that are going to go do something different. So if I give them time and space, and it's an interchange, it's a sharing, a back and forth. And I'll say something like, I approach this conversation without certainty, but with curiosity, and that has roots in neuroscience and how, the parts of our brain that process those things, and the creative parts. So sharing has to be this two-way exchange. You share a meal, those things that are innately human.
yeah.
Your story, I alluded to this a minute ago, but my son and I geek out on canoes. We just got back from racing the 90-mile canoe classic this weekend. And but we have a cedar strip race boat that was a one of a kind. It was the boat that the Savage River Company made to get just right, and then they make the mold for all the Kevlar and carbon boats from it. So we've got a one of a kind, unique cedar strip race boat. And what do? We stripped it down and refinished it. We cared for it. We don't even like paddling that boat. It is so tight and so small and so uncomfortable that we don't even like paddling it. But it is one of a kind. Well, you are one of a kind. No person in the world has the combination of thoughts and experiences that you have. So your stories matter because they are one of a kind. And if they're not in the world, we're missing them. No one else can reproduce them. So your stories matter because you matter. And stories are those things that are innately human. The more technologically connected we are, the less we seem to understand each other these days, where the opposite was absolutely necessary for survival in prehistoric times. Humans have been on this earth for 300,000 years. It's only been 7,000 years since the invention of the wheel. Humans survived because they worked together. The only way they could work together is to share their stories, and their short stories had understanding of how to collect food and how to survive from predators and how to run to the hills when the tsunami was coming or whatever it was. And baked in our DNA, people who shared stories better had offspring who survived at a higher rate. People who understood stories and focused on them survived at a higher rate. So it's in our biological evolution that stories are innately human, which is why when you hear a good story and you're invited into it, ooh, something perks up. It's not next slide, please. It's here we are. This is me. And it doesn't have to be polished. It just has to let it rip.
Right. And I think for people listening, as we talked about just for a second before we pressed record, people listening to this podcast, they love stories, right? They read them and they devour them and they make them their own. They often are notebookers or journalers. But I still, when I talk to people and I ask, you know, are you a writer? Do you write? What do you write about? There always still is a hesitancy of, oh, well, I couldn't do that. I don't have anything good to tell. So I love how you just really reiterated for us, we are all unique. We are all one of a kind. And whatever path we have taken, that is a story, right? Now, what we think of our stories, I think we tend to get critical. Oh, that's not a story. That's not like that story. That's a better story. That person can tell that story. And this was such a good reminder that no matter who we are or where we are or what we even plan to do with it, we have one that someone else might need. And that's how I loved the sharing, that interaction piece, because if I tell my story, I could impact yours. And if you tell your story, then you could impact someone else's. And that's the beautiful domino effect. I think a book like yours and a philosophy like yours has to just make everything better because we felt like we had a story worth sharing.
That's great. That's a different lens. See, this is the first time I'm thinking about that in this way. So it's one of the things I didn't know was going to come, but so one of the reasons I'm so excited to be here with you. That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You know, it's funny. Carol told me the same thing. Like, I
Yeah.
did it that that way. And that's the beauty of having different readers who need your book or want your book at different phases and kind of come away from it with a different view. Now, I loved all of the rules, but I do have to say the rules talking about, or the rule that was talking about curiosity, right? And
Yes.
coming to it not with certainty, but with curiosity, with questions. I connected really deeply to that right now because I love learning. Right? I love reading. I love writing. I love learning something new. And I learned about myself recently. Well, actually, I didn't just start. I'm almost finished with my yoga teacher training. Something I thought I could never do. I could never do that, but I did it, and I just jumped in and I realized it's that curiosity that pushes me forward. Like, I don't know if I'll ever teach yoga to someone as a yoga teacher, but that process of just learning more about it, asking those questions, as you mentioned, and seeing just what I could take from it, that curiosity piece I realized is so much better than whatever the outcome will be. And you talk about that beautifully in the book. I'd love if you could just talk about that curiosity piece more. I think that's what could be the ticket for people to realize, oh, I can do that. I can do that.
Yeah.
I do that right now. So I'll stop talking. You say more about that one.
Yeah. So a reflection on your yoga first. What a neat way to kind of frame that. You could go get out your yoga mat and go all by yourself and do a bunch of yoga, and for your body it would be fine. But by taking a class and learning how to teach yoga, you're actually doing that in service of others.
Mm.
Similar to mountain biking for me. I love to mountain bike, but I got into mountain biking. I was a coach while I was an intermediate mountain biker, and in service of others and learning how to teach mountain biking, I became way better and I have way more fun. And but way better than if I just focused on my own fitness and my own mountain biking. So anyways, but
Yeah.
that's kind of the curiosity of how can I connect with others. And in these days of divisive media, divisive politics, and people getting rich dividing us, frankly, there are lots of people that we encounter that are approaching everything with a sense of certainty. When we have a sense of certainty, any any view that's different can be processed in the amygdala, the part of the brain that processes threats, because it's a threat to my certainty. When your amygdala fires, that's the same part of the brain that fires when a kid runs out in front of you when you're driving your car. You don't think, I should probably move my foot from the right to the left and put that square, that rectangular uh, brake pedal down. And, you don't have time to think through all that. You just do it. Or if a lion is attacking you. But our brains process threats all the same, whether you're getting chased by a lion or whether someone challenges your certainty, and the rest of your brain is not available to you when that happens. If you approach a conversation or a speech or really any story, even writing, with a sense of curiosity, that is only processed in the neocortex, the most creative part of the brain, as far from the amygdala as it can be, and it opens up more, just more brain power. We say that most of our brain lies dormant. Well, there is those words, moving from certainty to curiosity, is one of the key things to opening up the brain. And the curiosity is really that inviting others in, because my story is just mine. And while it's unique and it's mine, if it's only mine, the focus is pretty narrow. When I invite others in, I can take my story and enrich it, and it can become much bigger than me. And I'm just the one telling it, but it really has lots of inputs. Interestingly, I through my real responsibility. I had some phenomenal mountain bikers on my team. One is very highly nationally ranked now, and will be in college. And I took on this responsibility to be the best coach I could be for her, because she was really putting in tons of effort and highly skilled. So I started listening to the Finding Mastery podcast with Michael Gervais, and I really kind of geeked out on it. And he put me on a path of doing a bunch of other research and whatnot. So I thought, I wonder, and so there's curiosity. I wonder if he is happy with the way I reference his work in my book. So I found a way to connect with him on LinkedIn, and I asked him if he would have a look to make sure that he was happy with the way I honored his work. And he sent a note. Sure, here's the name of my assistant, and here's her email. And she loaded up my book on an early version on a tablet for him when he went on a plane, and he got back to me with comments. And indeed, he does appreciate. So here's maybe the most famous high performance psychologist in the world, and he just read my book and he gave me feedback because I invited him in with curiosity. So that's a combination of, that invite others in, but it invite your kids in, invite somebody that you just met on the street into your story, or invite the top people you can think of in the industry. It doesn't matter. You just invite them.
Oh, I
It's
love
pretty great.
that. I love that. I love knowing that. I love the whole story behind that. It brings up two things for me. And I'm curious to know if this happens to you too in this shift from certainty to curiosity. Early on, when I was in my education career, I remember I finished my master's degree in literacy. And at a point where I should have been, woohoo, I'm done. I've learned all I need to know. Like, give me the diploma and get me out of here. Let me move on. I remember saying when I got that piece of paper, okay, there are way more things now that I realize that I don't know. I'm not done. Like, I have to keep going. And that pushed me to the next degree. Now with this yoga training, I'm finishing my 200-hour training. I'm getting to the end, and now I'm going, but there's so much more. Now I'm
Yeah.
even more curious about. So does that happen to you when you start with that curiosity? It feels like to me, it just has this wonderful snowball effect of, okay, now I need to know that. And now I want to know that. And then I jump down the different rabbit holes and I love it. Is that you
Yes.
too?
Oh, absolutely. And it happens. I'm a geographer by training, and it happens out in the real world. Every time I go, and I do ski mountaineering on Mount Washington, New Hampshire. And every time I take a different line or go to a different part of the mountain, I look across and I see another line. I look across and I see another line. And we pour into the maps. And every place we go, I wind up with 10 more places I want to go. And it
Yes.
just is so exciting and fulfilling. And the world is so big. And I'm just going to do my best to satisfy the curiosity, whether it's out in the wilderness, whether it's in service of others, or just like I never thought I'd be studying neuroscience, anthropology, and psychology in order to live out my mother's legacy. Who would have ever thought? But here we are. Just it doesn't matter. Let's go.
That's right. You just follow the yeses and you follow the curiosities. You said something else too, like you took a big leap reaching out to a mentor that you really loved and found so much worth in. That is something that can be a really scary thing of, oh,
Yeah.
should I do this? I'm not good enough to do that. I love that you did that. And I'm not going to quote it correctly from the book, but you talk about flow in the book
Right.
and getting into that flow state. And I loved the premise behind that was in order to get inside the flow, you need to get outside of your comfort zone. Right? You
Right.
need to take those risks that then fill you up and fuel you up and give you the confidence and put you in that flow. And I was reading your book at that point. I had my sticky notes next to me and I wrote, to get inside my flow, I have to get out of my comfort zone. And I thought, there it
Right.
is. It's finding your story, sharing your story, and then building your story. I just loved that. I loved that whole idea about it, Frank.
Yeah, I went to the mailbox a few years ago and just checked the mail, and I had a package from my friend Karen, who was at the time the Geographic Information Officer for the state of Wyoming. And I unwrapped this package, no correspondence in it. It was just a flag that says "Seek discomfort." I have it hanging right here next to my computer. And
Yes.
this morning, I had a short workout. I stretched, jumped in the shower, turned the water on. 49-degree water hits me. I can seek discomfort, no problem, right? Because it's safe. I'm not going to have hypothermia. But I start my day with, I can do hard things. This is good. This feels good. Right. And it's just this mental exercise. It's good for the body, good for the mind. So yeah, it's outside the comfort zone. I'll tell you a quick thing about stories with outside the comfort zone. I was asked to teach a class in our church religion program, and it was a class for eighth graders, and the subject was sexuality and relationships. So if you can talk about sexuality and relationships with eighth graders in a church setting, there's no danger in that. It's
You can do
totally in my
anything.
safety zone. But oh my God, that's terrifying, right? So if I can do that, then talking about my book or talking about geography or whatever it is at the podium, all of a sudden it's way less terrifying. So do something harder was part of it, and that's so some of these we're mixing some of the rules. If you want
We
to
are.
do something harder. So I've had that flow state happen in athletic kind of things during canoe races, during seemingly consequential ski lines or climbs for skiing, when I'm still in my safety zone, but the palms are sweating and my heart's pounding just because of the perceived exposure. But it happens way more often when I'm in the zone. Time stops, although I keep track of time. Parts of my brain open up that normally don't when I'm in an important talk at a podium and things are ticking along, and it's this juxtaposition of skill, challenge, and consequence. And when it all is in balance, you get this adrenaline and dopamine mixture firing in your body. It's amazing, and it's a high. And you normally don't even realize, I don't realize that I'm in this flow until afterward, but it's pretty neat.
Yeah.
I had one really impactful talk where I just came back to my seat in the audience afterward, and I was shaking, but happy. But then I just crashed. And a friend of mine goes onto the podium next, and I want to hear his talk. And I fell asleep. Maybe I passed out. I just gone, right? But it was just like all this energy. It's like, wow, that was something. I went up to him afterward and shook his hand and said, "Oh, I really would have loved to have heard that. Sorry." And he's like, "Oh no, I know exactly what happened." It was pretty neat. So,
Yeah.
anyways, it's and just leave yourself the room to do those things. It's fine, you know.
Right. Right. Well, that brings me, even though you mentioned it earlier, that kind of brings me to another one of your rules. And I do love combining rules together. But you talk about the energy in the pause, right? And that pause and giving you that space, and that space is actually so important. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I feel like while you're talking about it in the context of sharing your story, it's just a good life lesson as well. So I think it could be
Yeah.
magnified in other areas of our life. So I'd love to hear you talk about that.
Absolutely. Early in my public speaking career, I had so much to say and I wanted to say it all and I want to say it really fast and just lost people. Sort of like someone who's a just becoming an accomplished musician, where the pause in the music score is just to take the breath to get the rest of the music out. And the best musicians, there's meaning in the pause and they're playing the pause. My favorite drum riff is the beginning of Burning Down the House at Talking Heads. And it's that syncopated, almost too long of a pause between the drum hits afterward. Barbecue chefs and smoking, well, barbecue and grilling folks argue about everything. The one thing they have in common is let it rest.
Yeah.
Wine connoisseurs all have different opinions, but you open a bottle of red, let it breathe,
Yep.
right? Even in religion, Christianity um, and Judeo-Christian, on the seventh day, God rested. In Hindu, reveling in stillness is what some of the gods practiced.
Yes.
There's power in the pause. And the pause, like you mentioned earlier, the pause is what allows people to think for themselves, just like the blank pages in the book where there's questions and it's a guided journaling. The pause when you're sharing a story verbally allows for that space. People are worried about being interrupted. When I'm intentionally pausing, that space is filled with intention that people pick up on. It's playing the pause is powerful and can really raise goosebumps. You
Yeah.
have that pause that's well timed. It's a pretty neat thing to understand, and it is the thing that has helped my public speaking the most. It's the thing I most needed because I was just rattling through with more content than I should have packed in.
That is always my problem as well, always, especially as an educator, when you just want to say so much and show them so much. But
Yeah.
when you do that, you don't give them any time to think or to reflect. There's a quote that my own mentor told me early on in my education career, especially when I started working with adults. She said, "The one who does the work does the learning." So if you're constantly on and at them and talking, when do they stop? When do they think? When do they reflect? When do they do it? And so as I was reading your rule about pause, I thought, oh, there it is again. There's the reminder that I need again.
Yeah,
Um,
I was giving one talk and I handed out, there's 350 people in the audience, and I had helpers hand out 3 by 5 cards to everyone. And I asked them to put 3 things in the card. And I sat and the room went silent and everyone wrote something in their card. And now they were all assigned to stand up, find someone they don't know and ask them something that's on their card. And that set the tone for the whole conference because that was the opening keynote. And I said, we're at a conference. We're here to confer with one another. You've just invested your own time in pausing to think about something you aspire to, something you're proud of. I forget what the other question was. And I said, but I had to really like damp the group down and get everyone back in the seats to continue the conference. But I said, there's good news. You're going to continue this. You're going to do this 3 more times throughout the conference. And there's free drinks involved. And people look at me like, I said, if you pull out your card and ask someone for what's on their card and they don't have their card with them, then they owe you a drink. So I jumped on a plane and flew out to Salt Lake City, and I was at another conference that same night, and there was people from the same company that were in both conferences. And at midnight, which was 2 o'clock in the morning in New York, um, he got a text saying, "Oh my God, are you with Frank?" He said, "Yeah, I am." And he said, "Well, I'm at a bar and people are pulling their cards out." It was so good. But the pause is what got everyone engaged,
right.
because it was their story. It was their, it set the tone. It was great.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I do want to make sure I ask you about one other rule. It's actually the last rule, and that's embrace the joy, which I think is another one that's just a beautiful life lesson as well. But can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, yeah. And it's been a shift in my life. When I was young, I was really focused on having fun, and I had a lot of fun. And then I was like, maybe I should be focused on something a little broader. Maybe I should focus on happiness. And then, like, so the first time I took a crack at the outline, the rule 10 was going to be have fun. And then I listened to a podcast actually with Jim Nance, the NBC sports announcer, and Michael Gervais. And going into the broadcast booth, somebody told Jim Nance, have fun. It's like, well, if I was really going to take that advice, I'm at a football game. I'd paint my chest blue and I'd rip my shirt off and I'd slam a beer and I'd go, that would be wildly inappropriate. But instead, I'm going to find the joy in sharing the energy of this stadium and the details of what's happening to people all around the world. And I'm going to feel that connection, and that's going to give me joy. And I thought, oh, okay, that's good. So I went from fun to happiness to joy. And I've taken that a bit further, even in the last few months, with really reaching for fulfillment. And that allows me to sit down in front of my computer and do something that doesn't come easily to me and maybe isn't fun right now, but I get I get this fulfilling feeling from it, and it brings me joy. And it turns out I'm having more fun than ever than when I was focused on having fun.
Yeah.
So when we're sharing a good story and it's all flowing, and you get that little nod, or you get someone pausing with that look, and the wheels are turning, or you get that really good comment, then and you're tuned in to looking for the joy, that's a feedback loop that just is a virtuous circle.
Yes, yes. And we could go deep together, I imagine, on all the brain research behind that too, because that
Oh yeah.
is just this really cool thing that happens in our brains and the reticulating, what is it, reticular activating system and this chemical
Yes.
releases. Oh, I love it. You're right. It is a loop that if you're
Yeah.
intentional about that loop can really bring you a lot more joy.
Right. And I've got The Power of Fun, thanks to your recommendation, on my nightstand. I'm halfway through it, and that's reinforcing so much of what we're talking about here. There's so many people that are onto the same sort of stuff, but it's neat because it's applied differently, and I think is applicable to people who are looking for different things.
Yeah.
There really
So
can be joy in public speaking.
there can
Yeah.
be, right? I think, there can be joy in so many things that we might not realize at first because of what you said. It's what is it building for? What is the meaning that comes after when I am
Right.
done? So for someone sitting here, I know we've convinced them that they have a story. I know we've convinced them that they need to share it. They need to share it with others, perhaps get out of their comfort zone and think about what that looks like for them. And at the end of the book, you have this section called Your Turn, Your Rules. And you
Yes.
recommend thinking about your story as a starting place in the third person as a
Yes.
different way in. And I thought that was just such a brilliant way to remove whatever personal, oh, I don't know if I can do it. I don't know if I have a story, to remove that because you're talking about yourself differently. Tell for listeners who are ready, like, okay, I want to try this. Talk about that recommendation and what someone might do if they were to go get their notebook right now or think about their story in a different way. Talk about that as an entry point.
Yeah, the third person does, it's another way to engage parts of the brain that otherwise lie dormant when we're just sitting here pondering. So using our own name and hearing, and even out loud, you might want to be in private, or if you don't care if people think you're crazy, which is the right way to live. I mean, we're all a little crazy, but
That's right. That's right.
if that would be an impediment, people listening in person, you could say something like, "Hey, Frank, way to go. You booked this with Stephanie 3 months ago, and you knew it was going to be on the day after the Adirondack Canoe Classic, and you just knew that instead of and you said, oh, let's pick 9 o'clock in the morning, let's get after it. So you jumped right in. You went right from a super intense physical weekend into dry the gear out, sit down, and get after it. And your mother would be proud of you, Frank. Right. So I tied it back to what I just did, tied it back to my mother's legacy. I did it in a third person. And look at that. I got a little emotional reaction. I just made that up. And my eyes started to water just a little bit because of I gave myself some love. That's all true.
Yeah.
Right. So that's just a little on the fly example. Um, when I do a correlation between mountain biking and public speaking, you never thought, no one would really make that connection right off the bat typically, but it's all confidence and self-talk and whatnot. And I have two ways that I routinely self-talk. One is funny. I'll be riding along by myself, and I'll be talking like a sports commentator. Oh, we had a little bobble there, but what a recovery! And here he goes. Look at him picking him, and I'm just like narrating the thing to myself. And the other is my son Colin is the best mountain biker that I routinely ride with. He's just in the cycling industry, and he told me years ago, "You're a good mountain biker, Dad." So I hear that in his voice in my own head, and maybe I'm not, but I'll go act like it. Oh, when you act like a good mountain biker, you're a good mountain biker, right? So that third person out of your own head opens up the brain, and it's a way to build confidence. Confidence does not come from a admiration of our children, or which often it doesn't really happen, but often it does, or our parents or coaches, or the podium ceremony at a race. Or confidence comes from the stories we tell ourselves and the promises we keep to ourselves. So I
Mm,
kept a promise to myself this morning to let the world do everything I could to let the world know about this little book, because I think it can really help people. And here we are, right? So I'm going to congratulate myself from that by name. Hey, Frank, good job. And
yeah,
then that opens it up, right?
it
It's
does.
pretty
It
neat.
does. And I think we should challenge listeners right now to do that, whether they are, walking their dog and listening to this when they're done, they just whisper to themselves out loud if no one's walking with them. If they are at a place where they do have a notebook, because our listeners love notebooking, they just jot down some sort of story that they could tell themselves in the third person. I love how your example was, I don't want to say little because it was actually big, but short, I guess, just this short little
Yeah.
story that you told about yourself. It doesn't have to be your life story, starting with the day I was born all the way to today. We have so many stories, and anybody today could take a moment, take a pause, right? And tell themselves a story in that third person and just see how it feels. Just see how it
Yeah.
feels. You don't share it with anyone. Sharing it with yourself first is that first starting point. So let's issue
Yeah.
that challenge, Frank.
Yeah, absolutely. And that really lines up with Carol's statement in your podcast. The longest and most impactful relationship you are ever going to have is the one with yourself.
Yes.
You change
Yes.
that relationship, you're on your path, and the world's going to be a better place. It's
That's right.
fantastic. So yeah, what a great challenge. I will take that challenge and do something. I'll take a pause and when we get off and write myself a little note too. But you're right about it doesn't have to be long. In fact, it shouldn't be long. And part of Rule 6, I challenge folks to have a 20-minute, 2-minute, and 7-second or 15-second version of every story, and get the book and figure out the math behind all that and why that is. But the elevator pitch is that careful steward of time kind of thing. As a geographer, I happened to get on the elevator with the state um, CEO, CIO, excuse me, Chief Information Officer. And I said, "Hey, Bob, won't it be great when we make enough spatial data publicly available to move the dial on the economy?" And the doors opened and I walked out. And he said, "That guy's crazy." But 2 weeks later, his whole team was at my office talking to my whole team, figuring out what the hell I was talking about. So
Yep.
that
I love
7-second story with pauses, it only took 7 seconds, opened the door, changed the relationship. We got disproportional amount of resources. Had way more impact. And all my team got to tell their 2-minute version of the story, backed up by their answers that come from their 20-minute version. So it's this careful steward of time thing. That's the gift we have.
that
So
is that is the
thanks for
gift.
picking up on that.
We have to look at it as that gift. And
Right.
I know we didn't talk specifically about each one of your rules today, but I think that we've teased them enough and kind of combined some
Yeah.
of them together that listeners really do have a sense of what your book could give them, which is the chance
Right.
to take that pause and to think about their stories and think about ourselves and why we matter and why they are worth sharing in whatever way that we choose. I love your book, Frank. I think everybody
Awesome.
needs it to just be with themselves for a little bit and to realize the importance that's inside of us that we can tell. And if we're afraid of it, you have those 10 rules to literally walk us there again with that space to give us the pause. So I think listeners are really going to relate and and seek that kind of information because I know my listeners, we love our stories, and I think this will be a good one for to help them tell them.
That's great. And let's do something big, right? If you're not happy with the way society is communicating right now, let's do something about it together,
Mm.
right? Let's
That's right.
change it. Let's change the way we share our stories.
It just starts with one
Yeah.
story, the way that we
Yeah.
tell ourselves our
Right.
stories. Love
Right.
that. We have a little challenge and we have a big challenge too.
Sure. Let's do it.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. Now, we didn't mention this rule in the beginning, but I thought it's a perfect way to talk about it at the end. Rule number 5 is compliment your audience, compliment your
Right.
listeners in my
Right.
case. And so I just want to thank you for coming on to the podcast, for sharing your story with us as a way to encourage us to share ours. And I also want to make sure that I share this and compliment the listeners to us today. Like they're here, they stuck to the end. They are in this, they want to tell their stories. Thank you, listeners, for being here, for listening to me week after week after week, for being involved in my own story that I share in this way. It's a blessing. And I'm grateful for all the listeners. And I'm really grateful for you, Frank, for coming on and sharing your story with us today too. It's inspiring.
That's awesome. Mission accomplished for both of us. I really appreciate it. It's so
Yeah.
good.
So where can listeners find you online if they'd like to learn more about you or find your 10 little rules for sharing your story?
No, absolutely. So the book is for sale. The best place to get it right now is 10littlerules.com. And that's a numeral 10, littlerules.com. And there's an easy link there for the stories, the books, and you'll find it right there. So it got a cool cover with a
Yes.
brain and some a face and a lot of stuff going on in the head. So you'll recognize it just from that description. So that's the best place to buy it. It is available on Amazon, and we are going to put out a narrated version as an audiobook. But 10littlerules.com is the best place for it right now. The best place to connect with me is on LinkedIn, and it's just Frank Winters. And the LinkedIn connection there will help direct you to all the stuff I'm talking about. A lot of it these days is about the book. And I have a little business spun up for public speaking workshops based on the book and uh, communication coaching. So if there is an impactful presentation you need to make and you need a second set of eyes on your materials and want to tune it up some, I get so much joy out of helping people when it really matters, whether that's a conversation with your kids or a spotlight for 1,000 people, and or a job interview. Right? You're preparing for a job interview. How do you approach a job interview with curiosity and make that an exchange and not a performance, right? And there's some real good tactics there. So on LinkedIn would be the best place right now to fire any of that up. I'd really love to help. And you don't write a book these days to get rich. You write a book to leave the world a better place. And that's the little bit you pay for the book just helps keep me going. So it's hopefully it really, I think it will. So far, the feedback I've gotten has been genuine, and people are like, "Ooh, yeah, that did change some stuff in me." It's been really, really exciting to see the change that people have found in themselves.
I second all of that. Or maybe third it or fourth it.
Right.
Everybody is coming
That's
at you
great.
with it. I'll make sure to put links to the 10 Little Rules website as well as to your LinkedIn right in the show notes so that listeners can click on it and get to you easily. And thank you. Thank you again for a wonderful conversation. I loved it. I can't wait to hear from listeners about what they think too.
Oh, me too. Yeah, that'll be a great challenge. Let's fire it up.
Right.
Uh who has another way to look at it is the way I want to see it, right? Who has a dissenting view? Who has their
Mhm.
own way? And that really, let's let the curiosity shine through and let's expand it.
Yeah. Boy, you really do live the rules. I love it, Frank.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And listeners, thank you for listening to another episode of the Get Literate podcast. And I will see you next week. Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Get Literate podcast. You'll find links to all the books, resources, and ideas mentioned in the show notes and at alitlife.com. And if you want more, you might like to join my Patreon community. There, you'll find additional inspiration for your reading and writing life, like bonus podcast episodes, book calendars, monthly book clubs, notebooking inspiration, live events, giveaways, and more. It's only $5 a month, and you get instant access to all of the previous content too. Learn more at getliterate.co. And one more thing. If you love what you listened to today, please take a moment to rate and review the podcast or take a screenshot of the episode and text it to a friend. This helps the podcast grow and it builds our bookish and notebookish community too. Thanks for listening.